A wedding arranged by enemies, a storm that trapped them together, and a poison that was never meant to leave a survivor, only heirs to bury. Subscribe now, because what happened inside Kincaid Castle in the autumn of 1874 will stay with you long after the last page turns. Candlelight flickered across stone walls as the carriage wheels crunched over gravel, and Margaret Dunbar took her first look at the place that might become her tomb. The road from Perth to Kincaid Castle stretched 18 miles through country that seemed to grow wilder with every passing minute, as though the land itself was warning travellers to turn back. Margaret Elspeth Dunbar sat rigid against the leather seat of the hired carriage, her gloved hands folded in her lap, with the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned early that composure was the only armour available to her sex. Beside her, Fiona McAllister pressed her nose briefly toward the window, watching the Perthshire hills roll past in shades of amber and rust, the heather gone brown at the edges with the first breath of autumn. "It is very remote," Fiona said, not as a complaint but as an observation, in the careful tone she always used when she suspected Margaret already knew something and was simply waiting to say it aloud. "Yes," Margaret replied, "it is." She had studied what she could find about Kincaid Castle before leaving Edinburgh 3 days prior. Built in 1698, originally a fortified tower house expanded over the following century into something grander, 4 stories of grey Perthshire granite, a great hall, a library that Callum Reid had mentioned in passing as being surprisingly well stocked for a family more interested in land than letters. The estate covered 12,000 acres. The River Erne ran along its eastern boundary, crossed by 2 stone bridges that connected the castle grounds to the road toward Perth. In summer, apparently, the landscape was magnificent. In the 3rd week of September 1874, with clouds pressing low over the hills and the wind already carrying the smell of rain, it looked precisely like what it was, isolated. That had been Alistair Kincaid's condition for the arrangement. Not that Margaret come to Edinburgh, not that they meet on neutral ground in some comfortable drawing room. He had written to her Uncle Reginald with the specificity of a man accustomed to dictating terms. "Miss Dunbar will come to Kincaid Castle for a period of no fewer than 14 days prior to any formal agreement. I will not sign a contract of marriage with a woman I have not spoken to at length. I trust this is acceptable." Her uncle had brought her the letter with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "He sounds like a reasonable man," Reginald had said. Margaret had read the letter twice and thought that he sounded like a man who wanted the upper hand from the beginning. She had come anyway because she had no real choice, not at 24, not under a guardianship that would not dissolve until she turned 25 in February or until she married, whichever came first. The bank, her father's bank, her grandfather's bank, sat in trust administered by Reginald's careful hands, and those hands had always made her faintly uneasy in ways she could not yet quantify. The carriage crossed the first bridge over the Erne just as the light began to flatten toward evening. Margaret felt the change in the wheels beneath her, cobblestones now, the road becoming a proper drive, and straightened instinctively. Kincaid Castle emerged from between 2 stands of Scots pine exactly as the final turn in the drive revealed it, severe, grey, and unexpectedly large. Lights burned in the ground floor windows. A figure stood at the top of the stone entrance steps. "Is that him?" Fiona asked quietly. "I imagine so," Margaret said. Alistair James Kincaid, 4th Marquess of Kincaid, was not what she had constructed in her imagination during the journey north. She had pictured someone older, more obviously imposing, the kind of Scottish aristocrat who featured in the more melodramatic novels Fiona occasionally smuggled into their luggage. What she found instead was a man of 32 who was tall without performing it, dark-haired, dressed in a plain wool coat that made no concession to the fact that he was welcoming a prospective bride to his home. His face was composed into an expression of complete neutrality that Margaret recognized immediately because she wore the same expression herself in situations she found uncomfortable. He descended 2 steps as the carriage drew to a halt. Thomas Briggs, the mordomo, a compact, watchful man of 35 whom Margaret would later learn had served Alistair since his return from London, moved forward to open the carriage door. Miss Dunbar, Alistair said. His voice was even, neither warm nor cold. Welcome to Kincaid Castle. I hope the journey from Perth was tolerable. Perfectly tolerable, my lord, Margaret replied, accepting Thomas's hand as she descended. The roads were better than I expected. They deteriorate after rain. He glanced briefly at the sky, which we shall likely have before morning. It was, she reflected, possibly the least romantic opening exchange in the history of arranged marriages in Scotland. But there was something she respected in its honesty. He was not pretending to be delighted, neither was she. Mrs. Agnes Flint appeared at the top of the steps, a stout woman of 58 with iron-grey hair, pulled back with absolute authority, and the expression of someone who had managed Kincaid Castle through 2 generations of Kincaids and intended to manage it through at least one more. She welcomed Margaret with brisk efficiency, directed Fiona toward the servants' quarters for the evening meal, and began shepherding Margaret toward the entrance hall with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to managing arrivals. The entrance hall was exactly what the exterior had promised: stone floors covered with old rugs, a staircase of dark oak, portraits of previous Kincaids ascending the wall in order of increasing severity. The smell of the place was peat smoke, beeswax, and something older beneath, the particular dampness of stone that has stood for nearly 2 centuries. Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Flint said. You will have time to rest and change. Mr. Douglas Kincaid arrived this morning and will join you at table. Margaret noted that she said this last sentence with the precise neutral tone of someone who had chosen their words very carefully. Douglas Kincaid was, in almost every visible respect, the opposite of his elder brother. Where Alistair was contained, Douglas expanded to fill space, laughing at his own observations before others had time to respond, reaching across the dinner table for the wine decanter, rather than waiting for Thomas to pour, addressing Margaret with the easy familiarity of a man who had decided within the first 5 minutes that he had charmed her. He was 27, dark like his brother but with softer features, and an energy that read at first encounter as warmth. Margaret watched him carefully while appearing to attend to her soup. There were 4 at dinner: Alistair, Douglas, Margaret, and the family's lawyer Callum Reid, who had travelled from Edinburgh specifically for the preliminary meetings regarding the marriage contract. Reid was 61, silver-haired, meticulous in the manner of a man who had spent 4 decades ensuring that precision in documents prevented disasters in life. He spoke to Margaret with the particular courtesy men of his generation reserved for intelligent women they were pleasantly surprised to encounter. Your grandfather was an extraordinary banker, Reid said, during a pause between courses. Dunbar and Sons rebuilt its position after the Panic of 1857, faster than any comparable institution in Edinburgh. That kind of institutional resilience is no accident. My grandfather understood that panic was the enemy of good judgment, Margaret said. He used to say that a bank's real asset was never money. It was the confidence of the people who trusted it with their money. She felt, rather than saw, Alistair look at her from across the table. Wise man, Reid said, nodding. He was, Margaret agreed, and did not look at her uncle Reginald, who had arrived that afternoon with his solicitor Archibald Seaton, and who was currently cutting his lamb with the focused attention of a man who did not wish to be part of a conversation about banking wisdom. She found the letter at 10:30 that evening. She had not been able to sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the castle, the wind beginning to pick up outside the windows of the room Mrs. Flint had assigned her in the West Wing, the particular alertness that came from being in a strange place with people she did not yet understand. She had taken her candle and gone looking for the library, which Mrs. Flint had pointed out during the brief tour of the ground floor. The library was cold and smelled of leather and old paper. Margaret moved along the shelves with her candle, not really looking for anything specific, simply allowing her mind to settle in the way it always did around books. She selected a volume of Highland history, published in 1841, carried it to the reading table nearest the fireplace, which had gone to embers, and sat down. The letter was already on the table, or rather, the pieces of it were. Someone had torn it in half and then, apparently thinking better of disposing of it there, had left the 2 halves overlapping each other beside the empty inkwell. In the candlelight, Margaret could see that it was written in a hand she did not recognize. Cramped, quick, the handwriting of someone accustomed to writing fast. The date at the top, partially visible, showed September. This month, within the last 2 weeks. She should not read it. She knew that. She read it. The left half gave her, "Cannot delay beyond the October date. R has confirmed the documents will be transferred to Seaton's custody the morning after the ceremony, which means the window is smaller than we discussed. If K signs the inheritance contract before." The right half gave her, "Must appear natural. The physician in Perth is Reed's cousin, which complicates. Use the other means we discussed. D will handle the castle end. You will handle—" The letter ended there, torn away. Margaret sat very still for a long moment. The wind moved against the library windows. The embers in the fireplace shifted and settled. D, she thought. D will handle the castle end. She thought about Douglas Kincaid, who had laughed too easily at dinner and reached across the table for wine he had not been offered. She thought about her Uncle Reginald, who had not met her eyes during the conversation about her grandfather. She thought about Archibald Seaton, who had said almost nothing during dinner and watched everything. She thought about the inheritance contract. 30 days after the wedding, according to the terms her uncle had explained to her. Full transfer of the bank's administration from Reginald's custody to joint management under the married couple, with Margaret holding primary authority as the Dunbar heir. If Kay signs the inheritance contract before, she folded the 2 halves of the letter carefully and placed them inside the cover of the Highland history book. Then she carried the book back to her room, set it on the nightstand beside her candle, and lay in the darkness, listening to the first drops of rain begin to strike the castle windows. Sleep did not come for a very long time. Morning arrived at Kincaid Castle, the way it always did in Perthshire in late September. Reluctantly, through clouds that had thickened overnight into a low ceiling of grey that pressed against the tops of the hills and turned the loch beyond the east garden into a sheet of pewter. Margaret was already dressed when Fiona knocked at 7:30, having slept perhaps 3 hours in total, and spent the remainder of the night returning, again and again, to the 2 halves of the letter now hidden between the pages of the Highland history book in the drawer of her nightstand. She had made a decision sometime before dawn. She would say nothing yet, not because she was frightened, or not only because of that, but because half a letter was not evidence of anything she could name with precision. D will handle the castle end. Douglas, almost certainly. But almost certainly was not the same as certainly, and she had learned from her father that a banker who acted on incomplete information generally lost more than they gained. She needed more. She needed to understand the shape of what she was inside before she decided how to move within it. "You look tired," Fiona said, setting down the morning tray. "The wind kept me up," Margaret said, which was not entirely untrue. Fiona looked at her steadily for a moment, with the particular expression that meant she did not believe this but would not press it. They had been together 4 years. Fiona had come to the Dunbar household 6 months after Robert Dunbar's death, recommended by a friend of the family in Glasgow, and had proven herself indispensable within a fortnight. She was observant in the way that people who are accustomed to being underestimated often are. Quietly, completely, and with excellent retention. "Mr. Douglas Kincaid was in the corridor outside the east sitting room at 6 this morning," Fiona said, pouring tea with the casualness of someone reporting the weather. "I was coming back from the kitchen. He had papers in his hand, and looked, startled when he saw me." Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup. "Which corridor exactly? The one that runs behind the library?" Margaret said nothing for a moment. The library, where she had found the torn letter on the reading table the previous evening. The library with its single door onto that east corridor, and the secondary entrance through the courtyard passage that she had not yet discovered but would find that afternoon. The calculation was immediate and precise. If Douglas had torn that letter and left it on the reading table, he would have returned at first light to destroy the evidence. He had gone back and found the pieces gone, which meant he knew as of 6 o'clock this morning that someone had taken them, which meant the timeline inside this conspiracy had just accelerated. "Thank you," she said, and kept her voice entirely steady. "Say nothing of this to anyone." "Of course," Fiona said, and asked no further questions, which was one of her most valuable qualities. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room off the entrance hall. A room with a low ceiling and dark panelling, and a fireplace that actually worked, which made it considerably more hospitable than the grand dining room used the previous evening. Alistair was already at the table when Margaret arrived, reading a letter of his own with the focused attention of a man accustomed to conducting the business of a 12,000-acre estate before 9 in the morning. He rose when she entered, with the automatic courtesy of someone for whom manners were structural rather than decorative. "Good morning, Miss Dunbar. Did you sleep?" "Adequately," she said, which was the same calibrated non-answer he had given her the previous evening when she had asked if he found the London political season exhausting. She caught the faint shift at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, and sat down across from him. They ate for several minutes in silence that was not, Margaret noted with some surprise, uncomfortable. Outside the window, 2 groundsmen moved across the east garden in heavy coats. The rain had paused, but the sky made no promises. "Mr. Reed mentioned he would require 2 hours with you this morning," Alistair said, without looking up from his correspondence. "Regarding the preliminary contract terms, I have asked Mrs. Flint to make the study available." "That is convenient," Margaret said. "I had intended to request the same." He looked up then. It was the first time since her arrival that she felt the full weight of his attention, grey eyes, direct, assessing without being unkind. She had the sudden impression that Alistair Kincaid was a man who was very rarely surprised, but was making a small internal adjustment in this moment. "You have reviewed the terms your uncle presented?" he asked. "Twice," she said. "I had questions about the 30-day clause." "As did I," he said. "I told Reed so in my letter of August." Margaret set down her teacup. "What specifically concerned you about it?" He studied her for a moment. "The timing feels constructed," he said carefully. 30 days is an unusual interval. Standard inheritance transfers in Scottish law operate on 60 or 90-day periods. Someone specified 30 days deliberately. "My uncle specified it," Margaret said equally carefully, "on advice of his solicitor. Seaton, yes." A pause. Outside, one of the groundsmen said something to the other, and they both looked up at the sky. "Miss Dunbar," Alistair said, and there was something different in his voice now, a precision as though he were choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "I agreed to this arrangement for reasons that I will be transparent about if you wish to discuss them. But I want to be clear that I entered it with reservations that have not diminished since your party's arrival yesterday." "Reservations about the arrangement itself?" Margaret asked. "Or about specific elements of it?" "About specific elements," he said, "and about specific people involved in constructing it." They looked at each other across the breakfast table with the particular understanding of 2 people who have each, independently, arrived at the edge of the same dark conclusion and are only now realizing they have company. Before either could continue, the door opened and Douglas arrived, bright and dishevelled and carrying the energy of someone who had either slept exceptionally well or not at all. Good morning," he said, dropping into the chair at the head of the table with the ease of a man in his own home, which technically he was not. Kincaid Castle belonged to Alistair, and Douglas resided there on an arrangement that Mrs. Flint had once described to Thomas Briggs, in Margaret's subsequent hearing, as tolerance dressed as hospitality. Dreadful sky. "We shall be prisoners by afternoon if that front comes through." He reached for the bread without ceremony. "Miss Dunbar, you look remarkably well for someone who's just endured the Perthshire roads. Most people arrive looking as though they've been shaken in a jar." "I am a resilient traveller," Margaret said pleasantly. "Clearly." Douglas smiled at her, the wide, easy smile of a man who considered charm a professional skill. "Alistair, Reed wants you in the study at 10. Something about the Eastern Boundary Survey. Apparently there's a question about the Aberfeldy parcels." "I know about the Aberfeldy parcels," Alistair said, returning to his correspondence with the air of someone who has just ended a conversation and is waiting for the other party to notice. Douglas did not appear to notice, or chose not to. He talked through breakfast, about the weather, about a hunt he was planning to organise for later in the week if the rain permitted, about a ball in Perth the following month that he seemed to assume everyone would attend. He was very good at talking. Margaret watched him the way she sometimes watched potential borrowers at the bank who came in with large vocabularies and easy smiles, looking not at what they said, but at what they avoided. Douglas, she observed, never once mentioned the inheritance contract, never once addressed anything substantive about the arrangement between the families, never looked at his brother for more than 2 or 3 seconds at a time. And when Reginald and Seaton joined them at 8:30, Douglas greeted them with the specific warmth of a man greeting people he knew far better than the circumstances suggested he should. The meeting with Callum Reid lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes and confirmed several things Margaret had suspected. Reid was meticulous and honest. She established this quickly by asking 2 questions she already knew the answers to and watching how he responded. He answered both correctly and completely, without embellishment, which meant she could weight his other answers accordingly. The 30-day clause, Reid confirmed, had been inserted at Reginald's instruction in early March of that year. Reid had questioned it at the time. Reginald had explained it as a matter of expediency. Margaret's 25th birthday fell in February, and the family wished to ensure a clean transfer of administration as quickly as possible after the marriage. "Did you find that explanation satisfactory?" Margaret asked. Reid paused in the way of a careful man. "I found it plausible," he said, which was not the same thing, and they both understood that. "The inheritance contract," Margaret continued, keeping her voice level, "transfers administration of the bank from my uncle's custody to joint management under the married couple. Is that correct?" "Correct, with you holding primary authority as the Dunbar heir, by the terms of your father's will, and if both my husband and I were to die before the contract was signed." A longer pause. "The bank would remain under your uncle's administration until the matter was resolved through the courts. Given that you have no other direct heirs at present, and given the specific wording of your father's will regarding the conditions of the trust, that process could be protracted." "How protracted?" Reid looked at her steadily. "Several years," he said. "Possibly longer, depending on the legal challenges involved." Margaret nodded slowly and made a note in the small leather journal she had brought to the meeting. She could feel Reid watching her write, and said nothing further on the subject. Fiona found her in the West Garden at 4 in the afternoon, walking the gravel path that ran between the last of the season's roses and the stone wall separating the garden from the open hillside beyond. The sky had darkened further. The wind had a new quality to it, purposeful, sustained, coming from the northwest. "I need to tell you something," Fiona said, falling into step beside her without preamble, which was one of the things Margaret valued most about her. "This morning, after breakfast, when you were with Mr. Reid, I was in the small sitting room off the east corridor, the one with the window onto the courtyard. I was mending, and the window was slightly open." "And?" "Mr. Douglas was in the courtyard below with Mr. Seaton." Fiona paused. "I couldn't hear everything, the wind was already up, but I heard Mr. Seaton say, very clearly because he raised his voice for a moment, 'The timing must be exact, Douglas. R will not wait beyond the 14th. Margaret stopped walking. "The 14th, she said. "Of October." "I think so." "And Mr. Douglas said something in response that I couldn't hear. And then Mr. Seaton said," this part I heard very clearly, "she must not have time to involve Reid independently." The wind moved through the rose canes with a dry, papery sound. Margaret looked at the wall at the end of the garden, the hills beyond it, the clouds building in the northwest like something architectural. "She," Margaret said quietly. "Not they." "She." Fiona met her eyes. "That was what I thought as well." They stood in silence for a moment. A door opened somewhere in the castle behind them and then closed again. "Fiona," Margaret said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to be very ordinary for the next several days. Helpful, pleasant, unremarkable. I need everyone in this castle to forget that you notice things." "I can do that," Fiona said without hesitation, "and I need you to remember everything." "I already do," Fiona said simply, and turned back toward the castle entrance as the first drops of the new rain began to fall. Margaret remained in the garden for another 10 minutes, letting the rain start in earnest around her, thinking with the particular cold clarity that had always served her best in moments of genuine danger. She had come to Kincaid Castle expecting an uncomfortable negotiation over a marriage she did not want with a man she did not know, administered by an uncle she did not entirely trust. What she had found instead was something she was only now assembling into its full shape. A conspiracy with at least 4 participants, Reginald, Seaton, Douglas, and whoever had written the torn letter, designed around a timeline culminating on or before the 14th of October. She must not have time to involve Reed independently, so they knew she was suspicious, or suspected she might become so, which meant the margin for error on her side was smaller than she had initially calculated. She thought about Alistair Kincaid across the breakfast table that morning. Reservations about specific elements and about specific people involved in constructing it. He knew something, or suspected something. Whether he suspected his own brother was a question she could not yet answer. Whether she could trust him was a larger question still. She walked back toward the castle through the rain, her boots on the gravel loud in the wet silence of the afternoon, and made a second decision. She would need to find a way to speak to Alistair Kincaid alone. Not at dinner, not with Douglas performing warmth at the table, and Reginald watching everything with his careful eyes. Alone and soon, before the weather made everything harder. Above the castle, the clouds from the northwest had fully arrived. The last light of the afternoon disappeared behind them like a door closing. By morning, the bridges would be under water. The storm broke fully before midnight. Margaret heard it from her room in the west wing, not the polite September rain that had followed her into the castle that afternoon, but something with genuine intention behind it, the kind of Highland storm that the locals in Perth had warned her about when she had stopped to change horses on the journey north. The Erne floods fast when the northwest comes in, the ostler had said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing a neighbour's predictable behaviour. The Kincaid bridges go under in 4 hours if it's a real one. She lay in the darkness and listened to the castle absorb it, the wind finding gaps in the window frames, the gutters beginning to run hard, the distant sound of the Erne rising through the valley below the east grounds. Kincaid Castle had stood since 1698 and gave the impression of having weathered considerably worse. The stone walls were 3 feet thick in the older sections. The window glass rattled, but held. At 2 in the morning she rose, lit her candle, and checked the Highland history book in the nightstand drawer. The 2 halves of the letter were where she had left them. She read them again, slowly, looking for anything she had missed. Cannot delay beyond the October date. R has confirmed the documents will be transferred to Seaton's custody the morning after the ceremony, which means the window is smaller than we discussed. If K signs the inheritance contract before, must appear natural. The physician in Perth is Reed's cousin, which complicates. Use the other means we discussed. D will handle the castle end. U will handle. The physician in Perth is Reed's cousin. She had not focused enough on that line the first time. It meant whoever had written this letter knew that a death at Kincaid Castle would bring Reed's cousin as the attending physician, a man who might ask inconvenient questions, who had a personal connection to the family lawyer, who could not simply be managed. It meant must appear natural was not carelessness. It was a constraint. The method had to produce a result that a cautious physician would not question. Use the other means we discussed. She put the letter away and did not sleep again. Breakfast on the morning of the 16th of September was a muted affair. The storm had not diminished with daylight. If anything, it had consolidated, the rain now falling in sustained grey curtains that reduced the visible world beyond the castle windows to approximately 30 feet of gravel and the dark shapes of the nearest trees. Thomas Briggs informed the assembled party at 8:30, with the particular economy of a man delivering information he knew would be unwelcome, that both bridges over the Erne were under water. "By how much?" Alistair asked. "The south bridge by perhaps 2 feet, my lord. The north bridge considerably more, sir. The channel runs deeper there. I would not attempt either by carriage, possibly not on horseback either, until the rain stops and the water begins to drop." "How long?" Reginald asked. He was the only one at the table who had asked a question, which Margaret noted. "In a storm of this intensity, Mr. Dunbar, the Erne typically takes 18 to 24 hours to recede sufficiently after the rain stops." Thomas paused. "The rain does not appear to intend stopping today." A silence settled over the breakfast room. Douglas poured himself more coffee with studied nonchalance. Seaton studied the tablecloth. Reginald looked out the window at the rain with an expression Margaret could not quite categorize. Not quite frustration, not quite satisfaction. Something between the two. Alistair looked at no one in particular. "Then we are comfortable here for a day or two," he said, in a tone that closed the subject. "Mrs. Flint has provisioned the castle for a fortnight. There is nothing that cannot wait." The day passed with the enforced sociability of people trapped together by weather they had not chosen. Reed spent the morning in the study working through correspondence. Douglas organized a card game in the afternoon that Reginald and Seaton joined, and Margaret declined, citing a headache which Fiona confirmed to anyone who inquired with the convincing concern of a good actress. Margaret spent the afternoon in the library. She was not looking for more torn letters. She was looking at the room itself, the reading table where she had found the first one, the single door onto the east corridor, the secondary door at the far end that she had initially assumed led to a cupboard. She tried that door and found instead a narrow passage, stone-floored, that ran parallel to the main corridor for perhaps 20 feet before terminating in a wooden door that opened from the inside onto the courtyard. A secondary entrance to the library, one that did not appear on the brief floor plan Mrs. Flint had described during the arrival tour, one that would allow someone to enter and leave the library without passing through the east corridor at all. She stood in the passage for a moment, holding her candle, listening to the storm above her. Then she went back into the library, closed both doors, and sat down at the reading table to think. Dinner that evening was at 8, as established by Mrs. Flint's immovable domestic schedule. The grand dining room, which Alistair had apparently decided was appropriate for a party of 6, was lit by 2 candelabras and the fireplace, which Thomas had built up against the damp chill the storm had pushed through the castle walls. The long table looked slightly absurd for their number. They occupied one end of it, 3 on each side, with Alistair at the head, and the empty length of the table extending behind them into shadow. The first course, a clear broth with pearl barley, Mrs. Flint's concession to the weather, passed without incident. Margaret ate and watched and listened. Douglas was performing his usual warmth with slightly more effort than the previous evening, which was itself interesting. Reginald was quieter than he had been at breakfast. Seaton said almost nothing, which was his established pattern, but his silence had a different quality tonight, attentive, like a man waiting for a specific moment. Thomas served the wine with the second course, a Bordeaux dark red in the candlelight, which he poured into each glass with the unhurried precision of long practice. Margaret had never been a significant wine drinker. Her father had been abstemious by conviction, and she had inherited the habit without the conviction. She simply did not much enjoy the way wine blurred the edges of her thinking, and at dinner in a strange house where she did not trust at least 3 of the 5 people present, she wanted her thinking sharp. She covered her glass briefly with 2 fingers when Thomas reached her, a small gesture, the kind she had used 100 times at dinners in Edinburgh, without anyone remarking on it. Thomas moved on without comment. The second course progressed. Alistair was speaking to Reed about the Eastern Boundary Survey, the Aberfeldy parcels, the question of whether a recent enclosure by a neighbouring estate had infringed on Kincaid land. And Margaret was attending to this conversation with part of her mind while the rest of her watched the table. She saw it happen and later could not have said exactly what she saw. It was not a movement that announced itself. It was more an absence, a moment when Douglas's attention went somewhere specific, when Seaton's hands, which had been resting on the table edge, moved briefly below it, when Reginald asked Reed a question about the Aberfeldy matter that was just specific enough to require Reed's full attention for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was a very short time. It was also, she had learned in 4 years of watching men conduct business across tables, sufficient for a great deal. She looked at Alistair's wine glass. She could not have said with certainty that anything had changed. The level looked the same. The colour looked the same. But she felt, with the cold precision that had been her most reliable instinct since childhood, that something was wrong. She said nothing. She watched Alistair bring the glass to his lips and drink. He lasted until halfway through the third course. It was not dramatic in the way she had feared. No sudden collapse, no obvious crisis. It was instead a gradual withdrawal, a greyness that spread across his face over the span of perhaps 20 minutes, a stillness replacing his usual contained energy. He set down his fork with careful deliberateness. He said something quiet to Thomas, who was immediately at his elbow. "My lord," Thomas said, and the alarm in his voice was expertly suppressed but present. "I am not well," Alistair said, quietly, precisely, without performance. "I think I will excuse myself." Douglas was already half risen from his chair with the concern of a devoted brother, which made Margaret's stomach turn. "Alistair, the weather perhaps, or something you ate at luncheon." "I will manage," Alistair said, standing with evident effort and the absolute refusal to demonstrate weakness that Margaret was beginning to recognize as a defining characteristic. He looked briefly across the table. His eyes found hers. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She did not know what she communicated in that time. She knew what she understood. He knew something was wrong, and he knew she had not drunk the wine. Thomas was at his side. They left the dining room together, Thomas's hand not quite touching Alistair's arm. There, but hovering, ready. The remaining 4 at the table rearranged themselves around the absence. Douglas expressed appropriate fraternal concern and refilled his own wineglass. Reginald suggested that the Highland air affected some constitutions. Seaton returned his attention to his plate with the calm of a man whose evening had proceeded according to plan. Margaret ate the remainder of her dinner with mechanical steadiness and thought about what she was going to do next. She gave it 1 hour. She allowed the dinner to conclude, allowed the party to disperse toward the drawing room where Mrs. Flint had arranged tea, excused herself on the grounds of her earlier headache, climbed the main staircase to the first floor, and stood in the corridor outside the door of the room Thomas had pointed out as the Marquess's chamber during the arrival tour, the large room at the south end of the first-floor corridor, overlooking the flooded valley. She knocked. Thomas opened the door. He looked at her with the rapid assessment of a man deciding in real time whether to be an obstacle. Whatever he decided, he stepped back. Alistair was in the chair beside the fireplace, which Thomas had clearly just built up. He was in his shirt sleeves, which under any other circumstance would have made this an entirely inappropriate visit, and he was pale in a way that was not the paleness of a man with a simple headache. But he was upright, and his eyes, when they found her in the doorway, were focused. "Miss Dunbar," he said. His voice was thinner than usual, but controlled. "My lord." She stepped into the room. Thomas closed the door behind her and stationed himself near it, chaperoned by improvisation, which under the circumstances was the least of anyone's concerns. "I need to speak with you." "I imagined you might," he said. "Sit down, please. I find I am not equal to looking up at standing people at present." She sat in the chair across from him, the fireplace between them. In the grate, the new fire was beginning to take hold properly, throwing orange light across the stone floor. "You didn't drink your wine," he said. "No, why not?" "Personal preference," she said. "I rarely do." She looked at him steadily. "You did." A pause. "Yes." He shifted slightly in the chair, and the effort it cost him was visible. "Thomas has sent for Mrs. Flint. She has some medical knowledge. The physician in Perth is unreachable tonight." "The physician in Perth is Mr. Reed's cousin," Margaret said. Something changed in his face. Not surprise exactly. More the expression of a man who has been moving through fog and has suddenly identified a landmark. "You know that?" "I found a letter," she said. "In the library. 2 days ago. Someone had torn it and left the pieces on the reading table." She paused. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't because I had half a letter and no certainty about anything, and I needed to understand more before I acted. I am telling you now because the situation has clarified." "What did the letter say?" She told him. All of it, both halves, word for word, which she had memorized because that was what she did with important documents. She watched his face as she spoke. He listened without interrupting, without expression, with the absolute stillness of a man who has learned to absorb difficult information without letting the absorption show. When she finished, the fire crackled. Rain battered the windows. Somewhere below them, the urn ran full and fast over both bridges. "D," he said finally. "You believe that referred to Douglas?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. "Miss Dunbar," he said, and his voice had changed, not broken but opened slightly, the containment fractionally less complete than it had been, I need to tell you something that I have not told anyone in this house." He looked at the fire. 6 weeks ago, I received a packet of documents at my address in Edinburgh. Anonymously, no accompanying letter, no indication of the sender. The documents were financial records, from Dunbar and Sons. Margaret's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. They showed a pattern of transactions, he continued, spanning approximately 6 years, in which funds were transferred from the bank's operating accounts to a series of suppliers, coal merchants, shipping agents, property surveyors, whose invoices, on examination, showed consistent irregularities. Amounts rounded to implausible precision. Dates that did not correspond to seasonal patterns. 3 of the supplier names, when I had them checked, did not correspond to registered businesses in Edinburgh or Glasgow. £40,000, Margaret said quietly. Approximately. He looked at her. You knew. I suspected. I had begun to suspect in January, which is why I was about to engage independent auditors. Which is, she stopped, restarted, which is almost certainly why the marriage was arranged in March. The timing is not coincidental. No, he agreed. It is not. He was quiet for a moment. I agreed to the arrangement because I thought... Another pause, the careful word-choosing she was coming to recognize as characteristic. I thought that if the documents were genuine, you needed someone with enough legal standing and political connection to act on them. A husband under current law can pursue claims that a ward under guardianship cannot. You were going to help me, she said. Not a question. I was considering it, he said, with the precision of a man who does not overstate. I had not yet determined whether you were aware of the problem or part of it. And now? He looked at her across the fireplace with the grey eyes that had assessed her at breakfast and had been, she understood now, assessing her at every meal since her arrival. And now, he said, I have been poisoned at my own dinner table. The bridges are under water, and you have just demonstrated that you have been conducting your own parallel investigation since the night of your arrival. The faintest alteration at the corner of his mouth. I am reasonably confident you are not part of it. Despite everything, the storm outside, the situation they were inside, the man in the chair across from her who was pale and ill and holding himself upright through what appeared to be sheer personal determination, Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth exactly, something more structural than warmth. The sensation of weight that has been carried alone, beginning, fractionally, to be shared. We need a plan, she said. Yes, he agreed. We do. He moved again in the chair, and this time the effort crossed his face more plainly. Tomorrow, when I am more capable. Tonight, I need you to do one thing. What? Go back to your room, he said. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except Fiona or Thomas. Do not eat or drink anything that has not been prepared by Mrs. Flint personally, and brought to you directly. He met her eyes. They wrote, she must not have time. Which means you are also a target, Miss Dunbar. You have simply not been the first one. Margaret stood. The fire threw her shadow long across the stone floor behind her. My lord, she said, I have been managing my uncle's attempts to control me since I was 22 years old. I am not without resources. I am beginning to understand that, he said quietly. She crossed to the door. Thomas opened it without being asked. She stepped into the corridor and heard the door close behind her, the key turning in the lock a moment later. The castle corridor was empty, lit by 2 oil lamps whose light the storm outside made uncertain. Below her the dining room would be cleared by now. Douglas would be in the drawing room, or in his own room, or somewhere in this castle doing something she could not see. She walked back to the west wing with measured steps, her hand trailing the wall, counting doors. Inside her room, she turned the key, checked the nightstand drawer, checked the window latches, a habit from childhood that her father had instilled. The same father who had built a bank on the conviction that preparation was the only honest answer to uncertainty. Then she sat in the chair beside her own cold fireplace, the Highland history book in her lap, and listened to the storm work itself against the castle walls, while she thought about everything Alistair Kincaid had just told her, and what it meant, and what they were going to have to do next. Outside, the urn ran over both bridges in the darkness, cutting them off completely from Perth, from Reed's cousin the physician, from anyone who might have helped. Inside, somewhere in the castle, Douglas Kincaid and Archibald Seton were waiting for morning. Dawn on the 17th of September arrived without ceremony. A grudging lightening of the sky from black to the colour of old pewter, the rain still falling though with less violence than the night before, as though the storm had exhausted its primary argument and was now simply maintaining position out of stubbornness. Margaret had slept perhaps 2 hours in the chair, woken with her neck stiff and the Highland history book still in her lap, and had spent the remaining darkness doing what she did best when frightened, thinking in orderly sequences until the fear became manageable. By the time Fiona knocked at 7, she had a list. Not written down. She was not leaving written things in this castle, not anymore, but constructed and memorized with the same methodical precision she applied to bank ledgers. What they knew. What they suspected, but could not yet prove. What they needed. What they had available to work with. The list was not encouraging in every column, but it was honest, and honesty had always served her better than comfort. She opened the door for Fiona, who came in with the morning tray and one look at Margaret's face and said nothing for a full minute, simply setting down the tray and pouring the tea with the focused attention of someone buying time for the other person to begin. "How is the Marquess this morning?" Margaret asked. "Thomas was in the kitchen at 6, Fiona said quietly. "He spoke to Mrs. Flint. He said his lordship had a difficult night, but the worst appears to have passed." Mrs. Flint gave Thomas a preparation, something she makes from willow bark and elderflower that she uses for fevers. Fiona paused. Thomas looked, not frightened exactly, alert, the way men look when they are angry and are being careful about it. "Good," Margaret said. "Thomas being alert is useful." She wrapped her hands around the teacup. "Fiona, last night, after dinner, where were Douglas and Seton?" "Drawing room until approximately 9:30, Fiona said. "I was in the corridor outside doing needlework. I had asked Mrs. Flint if I might use the small table there near the lamp. Nobody remarked on it. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the practical unself-consciousness of someone long past formality with her employer. Mr. Douglas went to his room at 9:30. Mr. Seton went separately, perhaps 10 minutes later. Your uncle remained in the drawing room until after 10. I heard him moving toward his room when I was coming back from the kitchen." "Separately," Margaret said. "Douglas and Seton went separately." "Yes, but—" Fiona hesitated, which was unusual enough that Margaret looked at her directly. "I went to the kitchen at 10:30 for warm milk, because I genuinely could not sleep. The passage from the servants' stair comes out near the east corridor. There is a lamp kept burning there overnight." She met Margaret's eyes. "The lamp was out. The bracket was cold when I touched it. It had been out for some time, and the door to the library was not fully latched. The library with the secondary entrance through the courtyard passage. Someone had been in the library after the lamps were put out for the evening," Margaret said. "And used the courtyard entrance to avoid the main corridor," Fiona said. "Yes. That is what I thought." Margaret drank her tea and thought about what could be worth retrieving or concealing in the library at that hour, on a night when the castle's most significant resident was ill in his room and the bridges were under water. Documents. It would be documents. The library, she had noticed during her afternoon there, had a writing desk in the alcove by the secondary door, the kind of substantial mahogany desk with a lockable central drawer that suggested regular use for correspondence and record-keeping. She had assumed it was Alistair's working desk for the castle. She had not had the opportunity to examine it closely. She set down her cup. "I need 15 minutes in the library this morning," she said, "before anyone else is about. The desk in the alcove. I will create a reason for Mrs. Flint to need something from the east corridor," Fiona said immediately. "A question about the linen cupboard, perhaps. That will establish that the corridor is being used, and anyone there has reason to be." 10 minutes, Margaret said, revising. "I will be quick." The library at 7:30 in the morning was cold and grey, and smelled of damp stone and the ghost of the previous evening's candles. Margaret moved directly to the alcove desk, her candle in one hand, and tried the central drawer. Locked. She stood for a moment, thinking. Then she looked at the desk itself, the kind of Victorian library desk she had seen 100 times in solicitors' offices and estate studies, built to a pattern that had not changed significantly in 40 years. The lock on the central drawer was a simple pin tumbler of the type that operated with a small brass key. The type of key that, in most establishments, lived either in the drawer itself when unlocked or in a key box, or, in the habit of busy men who did not want to think about small things, on the same ring as the other estate keys. She looked at the items on the desk surface. A letter opener, an inkwell, a blotter with the faint impression of recent writing, too faint to read, a small leather-bound appointment book. She picked up the appointment book and opened it to September. The entries were in Alistair's handwriting. She had seen enough of it now to recognize it. Estate business mostly. Reed, contract review, Aberfeldy survey, Mackenzie. And then, on the 15th of September, yesterday, the day of her arrival, a single line, underlined twice, documents, R.E., confirm receipt, R.E. She turned the initials over, not Reginald. Reginald's surname was Dunbar, R.E. She thought about the anonymous packet of documents Alistair had described last night. The packet sent 6 weeks ago. Someone had sent him financial records from the bank, someone with access to those records, someone with initials R.E. She replaced the appointment book precisely as she had found it, took one more look at the locked drawer, and left the library. She had 7 minutes left and a new question. Alistair was dressed when Thomas admitted her to his room at 9 o'clock, dressed and standing, which was clearly costing him more than he intended anyone to see, but standing nonetheless, by the window that overlooked the flooded valley. The Erne was visible from here as a broad brown movement through the trees, running well above its banks. Both bridges were invisible beneath it. He turned when she entered. He was still pale, the skin around his eyes carrying the particular bruised quality of a night spent fighting something off, but his focus was fully present. "You look better than I expected," Margaret said. "I feel worse than I appear," he said, which is apparently the Kincaid condition in adversity. "Sit down, Miss Dunbar." "Thomas, I'll be outside the door, my lord," Thomas said, and withdrew. Margaret sat. Alistair remained standing, which she suspected was deliberate, a way of keeping himself alert. She told him about the library, the extinguished lamp, the unlatched door, the locked desk drawer, and the appointment book entry. She told him about R.E. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Robert Elliot," he said. "You know who that is. He was my father's secretary for 11 years. He retired to Edinburgh in 1869 when my father died, and I took the title." Alistair paused. "He is 71 years old. He has a modest house on Heriot Row. He contacted me in August, a letter, brief, asking if I would receive him on a matter of some importance regarding the Dunbar family. He looked out the window again. I replied that I would. He sent the documents instead. No explanation, no further correspondence. He had access to the bank's records," Margaret said slowly, because my father was a significant investor in Dunbar and Sons from 1851 until his death," Alistair said. 15% of the operating capital. The arrangement entitled him to quarterly financial summaries. He turned from the window, which means Elliot, as his secretary, would have handled and filed those summaries for 18 years, and would have noticed, Margaret said, when the pattern changed. Yes. A pause. And would have been frightened to go to the authorities directly, an elderly retired secretary making accusations against a sitting bank administrator, but might have believed that sending the documents anonymously to the current Kincaid, who had both the standing and the potential motive to act, was a safer approach. They looked at each other across the room. Outside, the rain continued its steady work. "The locked drawer," Alistair said. "I have the key." He crossed to the fireplace mantel, lifted the corner of a small framed silhouette, a child's profile which Margaret guessed was Douglas as a boy, and took a brass key from the narrow ledge behind it. He held it out to her. "I would rather you looked than me at present. My hands are not entirely reliable this morning." She took the key. "What should I be looking for?" "I put the documents Elliot sent me in that drawer 3 days ago," he said. "When I arrived from Edinburgh ahead of your party, I wanted them here where I could access them during the contract discussions." He met her eyes. "If they are gone, we know what was in the library last night." The documents were gone. The drawer contained 3 items: a stick of red sealing wax, a folded map of the Kincaid estate boundaries, and a letter from Reed dated August regarding the Aberfeldy survey. The financial documents from Robert Elliot, which Alistair described as comprising approximately 40 pages of bank records spanning 6 years, were not there. Margaret locked the drawer, replaced the key behind the silhouette, and returned to the room to tell him. He received the information without visible reaction, which she was coming to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of control over it. "Then they know I had them," he said. "Yes, and they know you shared them with someone, or they suspect you might, which changes their timeline." She sat down again, thinking. They cannot leave. The bridges are still under, which means whatever they plan to do next, they must do it here, before the water drops and Reed can be reached. She paused. They will try again, and they cannot risk it failing a second time. "Which means the second attempt will be less subtle," Alistair said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said. She looked at him. "Last night, when I was less capable of independent thought, Thomas told me something. He was checking the castle before locking up for the night, as he does every evening. He found something in Douglas's room." He paused. The door was not fully latched. "Thomas," a slight alteration in his voice, something careful. "Thomas has managed my household for 8 years. He knows his boundaries. He also knows when to exceed them in my interest." "What did he find?" Alistair looked at her steadily. A glass vial stoppered with wax containing approximately a tablespoon of clear liquid, hidden inside a boot, inside the wardrobe. The room was very quiet. Rain on glass. Fire in the grate. "A second dose," Margaret said. "That is what Thomas believed. He did not touch it. He replaced everything exactly as he found it and came directly to me." Alistair stopped. I was barely coherent. I told him to say nothing and wait for morning. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, needing the movement to think. The flooded valley below, the invisible bridges, Perth 18 miles away and entirely unreachable. 6 people in this castle, of whom 3 were actively conspiring, and 1 was ill, and 2, herself and Fiona, were, as Alistair had put it last night, not without resources. "We need Thomas and Mrs. Flint," she said, "fully informed. They cannot help us effectively without the complete picture." "Agreed. And we need to control the food and drink from this point forward, completely. Nothing reaches your table or mine that Mrs. Flint has not personally prepared, and Thomas has not personally carried. I will speak to Thomas this morning." "There is one more thing," Margaret said. She turned from the window. "The documents are gone, but we still have the torn letter. That letter connects Seaton to the conspiracy directly. Dee will handle the castle end. You will handle—" The second half is cut off. But Seaton's presence in this castle, combined with Fiona's account of his conversation with Douglas in the courtyard and the disappearance of the bank documents from a locked drawer, constitutes a pattern that Reed can act on. She paused. "We need to preserve the letter and get it to Reed the moment the bridges are passable." "Reed is in the castle," Alistair said. "Reed does not know what we know," Margaret said. "And I am not certain it is safe to tell him inside these walls, with Seaton in the next corridor. Seaton came here as Reginald's solicitor. If he suspects Reed is being briefed—" She stopped. "We need Reed at a distance. In Perth. On his own ground, with access to legal instruments we cannot access from here." Alistair looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she had not seen there before. Not quite admiration, which would have been too simple, but something in the family of respect that had deepened past its initial form into something more specific. "You think like a banker," he said. "I was raised by one," she replied, "and I intend to run one when this is finished." The ghost of something crossed his face. "When?" he said. Not a question, an acknowledgement of the word she had chosen. "When?" she confirmed. The meeting with Thomas and Mrs. Flint took place in Mrs. Flint's sitting room off the kitchen, which was the one room in the castle where neither Douglas nor Seaton had any plausible reason to be. Mrs. Flint listened to the account. Margaret speaking, Alistair seated, Thomas standing by the door with his arms folded, with the expression of a woman who had suspected something for weeks and was experiencing the grim satisfaction of confirmation. When Margaret finished, Mrs. Flint said, "I told Mr. Thomas in August that Mr. Douglas had had a visitor, a man I did not recognize, who arrived on horseback on a Tuesday afternoon when his lordship was in Edinburgh, and stayed for 2 hours in the west sitting room with Mr. Douglas, and then left without being offered refreshment or introduced to anyone." She folded her hands in her lap. "In 22 years in this house, that has never happened before." "Did you see the man clearly?" Alistair asked. "Well enough to know he was perhaps 50 years of age, well dressed in a city manner, with a solicitor's case." She paused. "When Mr. Seaton arrived with Mr. Dunbar 3 days ago, I recognized him immediately." The room was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Flint," Margaret said, "from this point forward, I need your kitchen to be a closed room. No one prepares or handles food for Lord Kincaid or myself except you, and no one carries it except Thomas. Can you manage that without making it visible?" "I have managed this household for 22 years, Miss Dunbar," Mrs. Flint said, with the dignified calm of a woman who had never once been questioned on her competence and intended to keep it that way. "I can manage a great deal without making it visible." "Good." Margaret stood. "Then we wait for the water to drop. We give them nothing to act on. We keep the letters safe. And we watch." Thomas, who had said nothing throughout the meeting, spoke for the first time. "My lord, the vial is still in Mr. Douglas's room." He paused. "I took the liberty this morning of placing a small mark on the wardrobe door at its base, a chalk mark, barely visible. If the door is opened, the mark will be disturbed." Alistair looked at his mordomo with the expression of a man recalibrating his appreciation for someone he had already rated highly. "Thank you, Thomas." "My lord," Thomas said simply. That evening dinner was served in the smaller dining room. Mrs. Flint's decision, explained to the party as a matter of efficiency, given the damp chill that had settled into the grand dining room. The food was simple and excellent. The wine was poured by Thomas from a bottle he had personally retrieved from the cellar and opened at the table in full view of everyone present. Margaret watched Douglas across the table. He was performing normality with considerable skill, the easy conversation, the fraternal concern for Alistair's recovery, the charming attention to the room. But there was something beneath it now that she could see because she was looking for it. A recalculation happening behind his eyes, a reassessment of some plan whose first stage had not produced the expected result. Alistair was across from her. He ate carefully, spoke when spoken to, and gave every impression of a man recovering from a minor indisposition. His colour was better than that morning. His hands, when he reached for the water glass, were steady. Their eyes met once during the meal, briefly across the table over the candles, nothing that anyone watching would have identified as communication. But it was. At 9:30 that evening, Thomas knocked quietly at Margaret's door. She opened it to find him holding something in a folded cloth, something small, handled with the deliberate care of a man transporting something he does not wish to touch unnecessarily. The chalk mark, he said quietly, was undisturbed. She nodded. But the mark on the vial stopper, I placed a single hair across it this morning, my lord. The hair was gone. He looked at her steadily. The vial has been opened, not removed. Opened. Margaret held the door frame. They decanted part of it, she said. That is what I believe, Miss Dunbar. She thought of the dinner table, the wine Thomas had opened himself, the water, the food Mrs. Flint had prepared. Tomorrow, she said. Yes, Miss Dunbar, Thomas said. I think tomorrow. She thanked him and closed the door and locked it. Then she sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace and thought about Alistair Kincaid 3 doors down the corridor, and the vial in Douglas's wardrobe with its level changed, and the bridges that might, if the rain stopped tonight, if the urn dropped at the rate Thomas had estimated, be passable by late afternoon tomorrow. One day. They had to hold this castle together for one more day. The rain stopped at 4 in the morning. Margaret heard it happen. The sudden absence of sound against the window glass, the way the castle seemed to exhale into the new quiet, the wind dropping to nothing as though someone had closed a door. She was already awake, as she had been for most of the night, and she lay still in the darkness listening to the silence and calculating. If Thomas's estimate was accurate, 18 to 20 hours after the rain stopped for the Erne to recede sufficiently, then the South Bridge might be passable by 10 o'clock tomorrow night at the earliest, more likely the morning of the 19th, which meant today, the 18th of September, was the day Douglas and Seaton would move. They could not wait for the bridges to open. Once the water dropped and Reed could reach Perth and telegraph Edinburgh, the shape of events inside Kincaid Castle would become visible to people with the power to act on it. They had perhaps 12 to 18 hours remaining in which the castle's isolation protected them. She rose at 5, dressed without waking Fiona, and sat in the chair with the Highland history book in her lap, not reading it, simply holding it. The two halves of the torn letter were still inside the front cover. She had checked them each morning since finding them, a habit that had become almost superstitious, the need to confirm they were still there, still real, still the one piece of concrete evidence they possessed. She thought about what Thomas had said. The vial has been opened, not removed, opened. They had decanted part of the contents, which meant the remainder was still in Douglas's room, diminished but present, which meant if they were methodical, which everything about this conspiracy suggested they were, there was a specific delivery mechanism already prepared for today. Not the wine. Thomas had closed that avenue effectively, and visibly enough that repeating it would be too obvious. Something else. She thought about the day ahead. Breakfast, the morning hours, whatever social architecture Douglas would construct to create the right moment. She thought about Alistair 3 doors down. He was already in the corridor when she opened her door at 6:30, standing by the window at the corridor's end that overlooked the east garden, dressed and watching the dawn come up over the Perthshire hills with the expression of a man taking inventory. He turned when he heard her door. They stood in the empty corridor for a moment. The castle was not yet properly awake. No sounds from below, no movement on the stairs. The rain stopped, he said. Yes, 4 this morning. I heard it. He looked at her. The corridor light was the thin grey of early dawn through old glass, and in it he looked tired but clear, the illness still present in the economy of his movements, the care with which he held himself, but his thinking visibly intact. Thomas believes the South Bridge will be accessible by tomorrow morning. Which means today is the day, Margaret said. Yes. They stood in the quiet corridor and understood each other completely, which was, she reflected, a remarkable thing to have arrived at after 4 days in each other's company under circumstances that had left no room for pretense. Alistair, she said, his given name used for the first time, which happened without decision or ceremony, simply because the formality of my lord had become inadequate to the situation. I need to know one thing before we go further. He waited. Douglas, she said, when you look at what we know, the visitor in August, the vial, last night's dinner, how certain are you? A long pause. The light shifted fractionally as the sun found a gap in the clouds over the eastern hills. Entirely certain, he said. The words were quiet and cost him something. She could hear the weight of what they cost, but they were unambiguous. I have known something was wrong with Douglas for longer than I have known the shape of this conspiracy. I did not want to know its name. He paused. I know it now. She nodded. Then we are agreed on everything. We are, he said. Which is... He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, brief and controlled. Not the conversation I anticipated having in September, Miss Dunbar. No, she said, nor I. They went down to breakfast. The morning proceeded with the surface texture of an ordinary day, the kind of ordinary that is constructed by people who need it to appear so. Douglas was at breakfast before them, which was unusual. He had never previously been at the table before 8:30. He was bright and talkative, and had apparently decided that the right approach to the day was an organized excursion, a walk to the ridge above the castle grounds, weather permitting, to view the flooded valley. The Erne in flood is genuinely spectacular, he said, applying butter to his toast with the enthusiasm of a man who had not spent the night recalculating. Alistair, you must have seen it from that east window. Remarkable sight. I have seen it before, Alistair said. Miss Dunbar, you really ought to see it. The ridge path is perfectly manageable even after rain. The ground is firm up there. It's the valley that floods, not the high ground. Douglas looked at her with the full warmth of his considerable charm. I thought a small party. Yourself, Fiona, if she wishes, myself, after breakfast. The air would do you good. You've been indoors for 2 days. Margaret looked at him pleasantly. She thought about the vial, partially emptied. She thought about the ridge path, which she had not walked and did not know, which would take her away from the castle and away from Thomas and Mrs. Flint and Alistair into terrain she could not predict. How kind, she said. I find I am not quite equal to a walk this morning. Perhaps this afternoon if the ground has dried further. Of course, Douglas said and smiled, and she watched the recalculation happen behind his eyes so fast it was almost admirable. Reginald, who had been quiet throughout breakfast, suggested that perhaps an indoor morning was wise regardless. The grounds will be soft for several days, he said. No need to risk an ankle. Seaton said nothing, as usual, but his hands, Margaret noticed, were very still on either side of his plate. The confrontation happened at 11 o'clock. She did not plan it. She was crossing the entrance hall from the direction of the library, where she had spent the hour after breakfast, verifying that nothing else in the room had been disturbed, when she heard voices from the study. The study door was not fully latched. The voices were Alistair's and Douglas's, and what she heard in the first 3 seconds told her that Alistair had not planned it either, that he had encountered his brother in the study, and something had been said that had made the conversation inevitable. She should have continued walking. She knew that. Instead, she stopped 3 feet from the door and stood very still, which was not eavesdropping in the deliberate sense, but was certainly not leaving. Alistair's voice, controlled but stripped of its usual social surface. Not asking for a confession, Douglas. I am telling you what I know. The visitor in August. The documents that are no longer in my desk. The vial that Thomas found and that has since been opened. A pause. I am giving you the opportunity to tell me yourself. Douglas's response, after a silence. You've been unwell. You're not thinking clearly. I am thinking with complete clarity. Alistair's voice had not risen. That, Margaret thought, was the most frightening thing about it. The absolute quiet. The urn will drop by tomorrow morning. Reed will go to Perth. The matter will be investigated whether you speak now or not. The only question is whether you are the man who told me the truth or the man who made me find it without you. Another silence. Longer. Then Douglas said, and his voice had changed, the performance of it falling away to reveal something underneath that was younger and rawer, and, Margaret realized with a complicated shock, genuinely frightened. I needed the money, Alistair. She heard Alistair exhale. How much? He said. £11,000, Douglas said. Over 4 years. The tables in Edinburgh. I know what you're going to say. I've heard it, I don't. It started small. It always starts small. And then Dunbar's man found out somehow, and came to me and said there was a way to make it disappear, to clear everything. He stopped. If you helped Reginald Dunbar kill his niece and her prospective husband, Alistair said, very quietly. A sound that might have been Douglas sitting down heavily. It wasn't supposed to. He said it would be managed carefully. He said the physician in Perth was manageable. He said a great deal, I imagine, Alistair said. And you believed him because you needed to. I am not. Douglas's voice had a fractured quality now, the coherence of it beginning to come apart. I did not want anyone dead, Alistair. I want you to know that. I did not. What happened at dinner was, I tried to make it. I told Seaton it was too much, that the dose was Douglas. Alistair's voice cut through the unravelling gently, but completely. Stop. Whatever you tell me now, tell me clearly, and tell me once, because I need to understand all of it. She learned the rest from Alistair an hour later in the library, with the door to the east corridor closed and the secondary door to the courtyard passage locked from the inside. The plan, as Douglas had described it, was architecturally simple. Reginald had identified the problem. Margaret was going to audit the bank, and the solution, she must not reach her 25th birthday as an independent agent. The marriage to Alistair had been arranged not as a cover for murder but as a mechanism. The inheritance contract, signed 30 days after the wedding, would transfer the bank's administration to joint Dunbar-Kincaid custody. If both Margaret and Alistair died before that 30-day period elapsed, appearing to die of natural causes, confirmed by a country physician who was Reed's cousin and therefore Reginald had calculated would be reluctant to make trouble. Reginald remained administrator indefinitely. He miscalculated Reed's cousin, Alistair said. Dr. Elliot, no relation to Robert Elliot, coincidence of surname, is apparently a man of some conscience who would have asked questions regardless of his connection to Reed. A pause. Which is why the letter said the physician in Perth complicates. They needed the deaths to appear entirely unambiguous. The other means, Margaret said, from the letter, Seaton's area, something that mimics the presentation of a fever, fast onset, plausible cause in a drafty old castle in September. Douglas says he doesn't know exactly what it is. He may be telling the truth about that. Seaton has the technical knowledge in this arrangement. Alistair paused. Douglas managed the castle access. He found the secondary library entrance independently. He grew up here. He knows this building better than I do in some respects. He took the documents from my desk 2 nights ago on Seaton's instruction. And Reginald, Margaret asked, handles the legal aftermath. Once the deaths were confirmed, he had a set of documents prepared, Seaton's work, that would formalize his permanent administration of the bank on the grounds that there were no surviving direct heirs. Alistair looked at the table. Douglas did not know about those documents until last night when Seaton mentioned them. That was apparently the point at which he began to understand the full scope of what he had entered. A crisis of conscience, Margaret said. She kept her voice even. Late and insufficient, Alistair said, but real, I think. He looked up. I am not asking you to find it meaningful. I am only reporting what I observed. She looked at him across the library table. The morning light through the rain-cleared windows was better than it had been for 2 days, pale and clean, falling across the old rugs and the shelves of books, and the man sitting across from her who had spent the last hour in a room with his brother, learning the precise shape of a betrayal. There is something else, he said. His voice had changed. Not much, the control was still there, but enough. The documents that Robert Elliot sent me, he said, the financial records from the bank, before they were taken from the desk. He paused. I had read them carefully. All 40 pages. And? The irregularities begin in 1868, he said. 6 years of diverted funds. But there is a section, the quarterly summaries from 1862 through 1865, that shows a different pattern. Not Reginald's pattern. Different amounts, different timing, different supplier names. He met her eyes. A pattern that was already established when Reginald took over administration. Margaret felt the room go very still around her. My father, Alistair said, received those quarterly summaries, and in the years between 1862 and 1865, when he was, I know now, looking back, that he was in financial difficulty. The Kincaid estate had overextended on the Aberfeldy land acquisition. He needed capital. He stopped. I believe he knew about the early irregularities. I believe he was offered something in exchange for his silence, capital, access, some arrangement that solved his immediate problem. And he took it, Margaret said. I believe so. The words were quiet and final. He took it, and the problem was resolved, and he never spoke of it. And he died in 1869, and the arrangement died with him, except that Reginald knew, and Douglas knew. Douglas told me this morning that our father had told him years ago, as a kind of insurance, as something to hold over the Kincaid name if it became necessary. A pause. It became necessary when I became a problem. Margaret looked at him. She thought about what it cost to say what he had just said, to lay out plainly and without deflection the worst truth about someone you had loved, to refuse the comfort of uncertainty when certainty was available and devastating. What will you do with it, she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The light moved on the library floor. Tell Reed, he said finally. All of it. My father's involvement as well as Douglas's and Reginald's. He paused. I will not preserve a lie to protect a name. That is precisely how we arrived here. She looked at him across the table in the clean September light and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Something that was not yet love, because she had known him 4 days, and love required more than 4 days, but was the thing that precedes love when the conditions are right. The recognition of a person's essential character in a moment when that character is most itself. "Alistair," she said. He looked at her. "I think," she said carefully, "that when this is finished and when we have both had time to recover from the particular experience of being conspired against in a Scottish castle during a flood, I would like to continue this conversation." He was very still for a moment, then something shifted in his face. Not the brief, ironic adjustment she had seen at the breakfast table on the first morning, but something considerably less guarded. "As would I," he said, "very much." Outside, the urn was still running high, but the sky above the castle was clearing, rapidly and genuinely, the clouds pulling apart to show blue in widening sections. By tomorrow morning the South Bridge would be passable. One more night. The afternoon passed in a careful equilibrium. Douglas had not emerged from his room since the confrontation in the study. Reginald and Seaton maintained their surface civility at luncheon, with the particular discipline of people who do not yet know they have been exposed. Fiona sat with Margaret in the west sitting room and did needlework with the focused serenity of someone who was listening to every sound in the corridor. At 3:30, Thomas appeared at the sitting room door and caught Margaret's eye. She excused herself and followed him to the servants' passage. "The chalk mark," Thomas said quietly. Disturbed this afternoon while everyone was at luncheon, she thought about Seaton's stillness at the breakfast table, his hands very quiet beside his plate. "He moved the vial," she said, "or what remains in it." Thomas met her eyes. "Miss Dunbar, I think it will be tonight." "So do I." She looked at the stone passage wall. "Thomas, I need you to do something that is outside your usual responsibilities." "I am aware of that, Miss Dunbar," he said, "and I am prepared to do it regardless." She looked at him. "You've known since the first night, haven't you?" It was not quite a question. Thomas answered it as though it were. "I have served Lord Kincaid for 8 years, he said simply. "I know the shape of things in this house, and I know what is not the shape of things in this house." "Then you know what we need tonight," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "I do." That evening, for the first time since her arrival, Margaret did not go down to dinner. Fiona delivered her apologies to the dining room, a headache, recurring, the damp air perhaps, and returned with a tray that Mrs. Flint had prepared and Thomas had carried to the foot of the west wing stairs. Margaret ate alone in her room, listening to the muffled sounds of dinner below, and watched the sky outside her window go from clearing blue to the first pale stars she had seen in 3 days. The urn was dropping. She could not see it from this window, but she could hear the difference in its sound, the roar of the flooded river settling toward the lower register of a river returning to its own boundaries. By morning, certainly by morning. At 9 o'clock she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Thomas's measured tread, not Fiona's quick light step, something deliberate and unhurried, pausing outside her door. She sat absolutely still in the chair. A sound, not a knock. The small specific sound of something being set down carefully on the floorboards. Then the footsteps moved away. She waited 3 full minutes. Then she opened the door. On the floorboard outside her room was a small cup, the kind used for warm evening drinks. A concession to guests, something Mrs. Flint offered as a matter of course. Warm milk with something dark at the bottom of it, steam still rising from the surface. She did not touch it. She picked it up by the saucer, carried it to the window, and looked at it in the starlight. The dark sediment at the bottom had not fully dissolved. She set it on the windowsill. Then she went to the door between her room and the small dressing room beyond it, opened it, and found Thomas standing there in the darkness, exactly where he was supposed to be. "Seaton," Thomas said quietly, before she could speak. He had positioned himself at the dressing room's narrow window, which angled toward the main corridor. I watched him place it. He came from the east staircase, the servants' stair, not the main one. He did not knock. He set it down and returned the way he came. He was wearing gloves. Gloves. The particular detail of a man who had done this kind of thing with enough forethought to consider what he might leave behind. "The cup is on the windowsill," she said. "Untouched." "Good." Thomas looked at it briefly. "I will take it now and seal it with wax from Mrs. Flint's kitchen. It will keep until Reed can have it assessed in Perth." He paused. "There is a chemist on the high street in Perth who consults for the sheriff's court. Reid will know him. Good, she said. Then it's done. He nodded and took the cup carefully by its saucer and left through the dressing-room passage. 30 minutes later she heard, from the direction of Douglas's room, and then the corridor, and then the stairs, the sounds that meant it was finished. She found Alistair in the entrance hall at 9:30. He was standing at the foot of the staircase with his hand on the newel post, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has done something irrevocable and is not flinching from it. Douglas was in his room, with Thomas outside the door. Seaton was in his room, with one of the groundsmen, a man named Mackenzie, who had served the Kincaid estate for 30 years and whom Thomas had briefed that afternoon, outside his. Reginald was in his room. Mrs. Flint had the keys. Reid? Margaret asked. I spoke to him 20 minutes ago, Alistair said, in full. He is, a pause, he is a thorough man. He is already drafting what needs to be drafted so that we can move the moment the South Bridge opens. And the cup? She asked. Thomas has it, preserved. He looked at her. It will be enough. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in the entrance hall of Kincaid Castle and thought about the 14 days from the 15th to the 28th of September, and all the things that had happened inside them, and all the things that had not happened that she had needed not to happen. Are you all right? Alistair asked. It was the first time he had asked her that. Not are you well or is everything in order, the formal inquiries of a man maintaining appropriate distance, but this plainly. She considered the question with the honesty she had given everything else. Not entirely, she said, but I will be. Yes, he said, I believe you will. Outside, the last of the clouds moved off the Highland sky, and the stars over Perthshire came out in their full number, reflected in the dropping surface of the Erne as it found its way back to its own banks. Tomorrow the South Bridge would open. Tomorrow everything would begin to be resolved. Tonight, for the first time since arriving at Kincaid Castle, Margaret Elspeth Dunbar sat in the entrance hall with Alistair James Kincaid and listened to the river settle, and felt, cautiously and precisely, and without permitting herself anything premature, something that might, given time and honesty, and the long work of building trust between two people who had come here as strangers, eventually become peace. The South Bridge was passable at 8:30 on the morning of the 19th of September. Thomas confirmed it personally, having walked the bridge at first light with Mackenzie, testing each stone, checking the depth of residual water still sheeting across the lower sections, and returned to the castle at 7:45, with the report that a carriage could cross carefully if the driver was experienced and the horses were steady. The Kincaid estate kept both. Margaret was dressed and downstairs by 8. Alistair was already in the study with Reid, who had not slept. She could see it in the careful way he moved, the particular brightness of a man running on urgency rather than rest, his correspondence case open on the desk beside him, 3 separate documents already drafted in his meticulous hand. He looked up when she entered and said, without preamble, Miss Dunbar, I owe you an apology. She sat down across from him. You owe me nothing, Mr. Reid. You were deceived by people you had no reason to distrust. I should have questioned the 30-day clause more forcefully, he said. I questioned it, and then accepted an insufficient explanation because... He stopped, and the honesty of what came next was evident in the discomfort with which he delivered it, because Reginald Dunbar had been a client of this firm for 11 years, and I did not want to believe what questioning it more forcefully might have implied. You are not the first person in this castle to have not wanted to believe something, Margaret said, and did not look at Alistair, and felt him not looking at her. Reid accepted this with the gravity it deserved. The documents I have prepared, he said, spreading them on the desk, address 3 immediate requirements. First, a formal request to the Sheriff's Court in Perth for an emergency warrant authorizing the detention of Reginald Dunbar and Archibald Seaton, pending investigation into financial fraud and conspiracy to commit harm. Second, a letter to the senior partner of Seaton's Edinburgh firm notifying them of the situation and requesting immediate suspension of Seaton's authority to act on any Dunbar-related matter. Third, he paused, a notification to the board of Dunbar and Sons Bank advising them that the current administration is under legal challenge and that all transactions should be suspended pending court review. "Who sits on the board?" Margaret asked. "4 members, including yourself as heir. Though your membership has been inactive under the guardianship terms, the other 3 are Sir Alistair Drummond, Mr. James Pentecost, and Mr. William Vass. All Edinburgh men. All, to my knowledge, uninvolved in this matter." "Drummond will act quickly," Margaret said. "He was my father's closest friend on the board. He has been trying to reach me independently for months. Reginald intercepted his letters." She paused. "I know this because I found 3 of them in Reginald's correspondence case in April. He told me they were duplicates he had already forwarded. I believed him." She said this without self-reproach, simply as information. "I will write to Drummond directly this morning, if you can ensure the letter goes with the carriage to Perth." "It will be the first thing dispatched," Reed said. Alistair, who had been standing at the window during this exchange, said, "There is a 4th matter, Reed." Reed looked at him. "My father," Alistair said, and told him. "Aqui está o bloco completo e exato que você deve inserir imediatamente após a linha My Father," Alistair said, and told him. Reed was quiet for a long moment after Alistair finished. He set down his pen. He looked at the desk surface rather than at either of them, which Margaret recognized as the posture of a man organizing something difficult into its proper compartments. "The late Marquess," Reed said finally, "died in 1869. There is no criminal process available against a man who has been dead for 5 years." He paused. "There is, however, a civil question. If capital entered the Kincaid estate between 1862 and 1865, as a direct result of that silence, capital that was in effect derived from the bank's compromise position, then a portion of that capital could be argued, in law, to belong to the Dunbar estate." "I know," Alistair said. "It would not be a large sum, relative to the broader damages," Reed continued carefully, "and pursuing it would require you to place the evidence of your father's involvement before a civil court, which would become a matter of public record." "I know that also," Alistair said. Reed looked at him then. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him. "I will include a full account in my report to the sheriff," he said. "The civil question can be addressed separately at whatever pace Miss Dunbar's legal counsel determines appropriate. It need not delay the criminal proceedings against Reginald and Seaton." He picked up his pen again. "I would note, my lord, that very few men in your position would have volunteered this information. The documents were destroyed. No one else knew." "I knew," Alistair said simply. Reed nodded once and returned to his drafting. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to add. She looked at the desk in front of her and thought that this was precisely what she had meant in the garden the previous evening, when she had told him that crisis was in some respects a more honest window than a dinner party. She had seen, through that window, exactly what kind of man he was. It was, she thought, a very good kind. The carriage left for Perth at 9 o'clock with Reed inside it, carrying 4 letters, the 3 legal documents and Margaret's letter to Sir Alistair Drummond, and with Mackenzie driving and a second groundsman on the box. The crossing of the South Bridge was slow and deliberate, the horses picking their way across the remaining water with the careful intelligence of animals that understood unstable ground. Margaret watched from the entrance steps until the carriage was through the gate and onto the Perth road, and then went back inside. The castle felt different in the morning light, quieter in some ways, louder in others, the sounds of it more present without the overlying tension of the last 4 days, as though the building itself had been holding something and had now released it. Douglas had not come down. Reginald had appeared at breakfast, and the breakfast had been the most extraordinary performance Margaret had ever witnessed. A man eating kedgeree and drinking tea with the surface serenity of someone who did not know that the carriage on the Perth road carried his unravelling. She had sat across from him and matched his surface with her own, and thought about her father, who had built something worth protecting, and about her grandfather, who had built it first, and about what it meant to be the end of a line and the beginning of one simultaneously. Seaton had not appeared at all. The sheriff's officers arrived from Perth at 2:30 in the afternoon. There were 3 of them, efficient, formal, carrying Reed's warrant, and a second document from the Edinburgh courts that Reed had apparently telegraphed ahead for from Perth, moving faster than anyone in the castle had anticipated. Margaret heard the carriage on the gravel from the library where she was working through a set of castle account books that Mrs. Flint had provided. She had needed something methodical to do with her hands, and went to the entrance hall. Thomas was already at the door. What followed was managed with a minimum of drama, which was, Margaret reflected, the best possible outcome. The sheriff's officers were experienced men who had done this before and had no interest in theatre. Reginald, when the warrant was presented to him in the west sitting room, went very still for a long moment, and then looked at Margaret standing in the doorway with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something stripped of its administrative surface, something older and smaller. "You found the letters," he said. "Not a question." "I found a letter," she said. "One. You left it in the library." He absorbed this. "Seaton's carelessness," he said, almost to himself. "Yes," she agreed. He was taken to the carriage with his hands unbound, a concession to his age and the absence of any physical resistance, and did not look at her again. Seaton followed, escorted by two of the officers, saying nothing, his face entirely closed. The carriage door closed. Before it moved, the senior officer, a composed man of 50 named Baird, who had said very little beyond what the warrant required, approached her on the steps. "Miss Dunbar, regarding Mr. Douglas Kincaid." He said it quietly, with the discretion of a man who understood that some conversations did not need witnesses. "Mr. Reed has communicated the particulars of his testimony to us. The sheriff has reviewed the matter and determined that Mr. Kincaid's cooperation, including his voluntary disclosure of the full plan and his documented attempt to intervene on the dosage, places him in a different legal category than the principal conspirators. He will be required to present himself to the Sheriff's Court in Perth on the 23rd with legal representation to provide formal testimony. He is not to leave Perthshire in the interim. And if the court determines his culpability is greater than that assessment allows," Margaret asked. "Then the matter will be escalated accordingly," Baird said, with the even tone of a man who made no promises outside his authority. "That determination is not mine to make, Miss Dunbar. It belongs to the sheriff and ultimately to the court." He inclined his head and returned to the carriage. The carriage moved down the drive. Margaret stood on the entrance steps and watched it go, and felt nothing for a long moment. A clean blankness, the space that follows extreme tension when the tension is finally resolved. Then, gradually, something else. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter. The knowledge that what her father had built was still intact and would remain so. Douglas came downstairs at 4 o'clock. He looked diminished in a way that was not entirely physical, as though something structural had shifted inside him, some load-bearing element removed. He found Alistair in the study, and Margaret heard, from the corridor where she happened to be passing, that he said nothing for the first several seconds after entering the room. Then he said very quietly, "I am sorry, Alistair." She did not stop to hear the response. That conversation belonged to them, and she walked on, down the corridor and into the library, and closed the door behind her. She understood, from everything she had observed in 4 days, that Alistair would not spare Douglas the consequences of what he had done. She also understood, from the same 4 days of observation, that he would not be cruel. He was not a man who confused justice with vengeance. Those were different instruments, and he knew the difference. Douglas would face a legal process. The extent of his culpability, whether it constituted criminal conspiracy or the more ambiguous territory of someone who had known and not acted soon enough, would be for the courts to determine. Alistair would tell them the truth of what Douglas had told him in the study, including the moment when Douglas had tried to intervene on the dose, for whatever that was worth. It might not be worth much. That was as it should be. Reed returned from Perth at 5:30 with 2 things: a confirmation that the warrants had been processed and the Edinburgh authorities notified, and a telegram from Sir Alistair Drummond, who had apparently been sitting by his telegraph machine waiting for exactly this kind of message for the better part of 4 months. The telegram read, "Received your letter. Board convenes tomorrow. All transactions suspended as of today. Drummond." Margaret read it twice and folded it into her jacket pocket and went to find Alistair. He was in the east garden, which was sodden and flattened by 4 days of rain, but navigating the gravel path anyway, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who needed air after a confined afternoon. She fell into step beside him without asking permission or offering explanation, which felt entirely natural, because by this point asking permission or offering explanation between them would have been performative. They walked in silence for a few minutes. The garden smelled of wet earth and the last of the season's roses, their petals beaten half away by the storm, but still present, still coloured, still producing that particular deep scent that intensified after rain. "Drummond convenes the board tomorrow," she said. "Good." A pause. "And the bank?" "Will need a period of careful management to restore confidence," she said. "6 years of diverted funds. Some can be recovered through legal action against Reginald's assets. Not all." She walked another few steps. "I will need to be in Edinburgh by the end of the week." "Yes," he said. "Of course." They reached the end of the garden path, the stone wall that separated it from the open hillside. The sky above the hills was the particular luminous pale gold of a Scottish evening after rain, the light lasting longer than it should at this latitude, as though the day was reluctant to end. "There is a question between us," Alistair said, "that we agreed to revisit when this was finished." "Yes," she said. He looked at the hills. "I am aware that the circumstances under which we met were not designed to produce reliable impressions of either party. We have spent 4 days in a state of sustained crisis. That is not," he paused, choosing, "that is not the most transparent window through which to know a person." "No," she agreed, "although I would argue that crisis is in some respects a more honest window than a ball or a dinner party." "That is one argument," he said. "It is the argument that happens to be supported by the evidence," she said, "which in this case includes 4 days of observation, during which you had multiple opportunities to choose a more expedient path, and did not take any of them." He was quiet for a moment. "As did you." "Yes." The light on the hills shifted, gold deepening toward amber. The Erne, far below them, was audible as a low murmur, back within its banks, finding its normal register. "I would like to come to Edinburgh," he said, "when you are settled and the immediate business of the bank is addressed. If that would be welcome." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. He was not asking about the marriage contract, which still existed in legal terms, and would need to be formally addressed, revised or dissolved, or rebuilt on entirely different terms. He was asking something prior to that, something smaller and larger simultaneously. "It would be welcome," she said. He nodded once with the economy of a man who does not need to elaborate when the essential thing has been said. They stood at the garden wall in the amber evening light, and did not touch. It was not the moment for that, and they both understood it, but stood near enough that the distance felt like a decision rather than a default. Two people who had arrived here as strangers, and were leaving as something not yet named, which would require time and honesty and the slow accumulation of ordinary days to become whatever it was going to be. Callum Reid joined them for a final dinner that evening. Just the 4 of them, Margaret and Fiona and Alistair and Reid, in the small dining room with the low ceiling and the working fireplace, Mrs. Flint's best effort at a meal that bore no relation to the managed tension of the previous 4 evenings. Thomas poured wine without ceremony or anxiety. The fire burned steadily. Reid, who was a thorough man in all things, had brought with him the marriage contract, the original with its 30-day clause and Seaton's careful drafting, and set it on the table after dinner with the expression of a man who had a professional obligation to address certain matters. "This document," he said, "is legally valid, but was produced under circumstances that would constitute, in my view, grounds for complete renegotiation. Given that the primary architect of its terms is currently in a Perth cell, I would recommend treating it as void and beginning again from a position that reflects the actual interests of both parties." "I agree," Alistair said. "As do I," Margaret said. Reid nodded, took the contract and placed it in his correspondence case. "I will draft a notice of withdrawal for both parties to sign in the morning. That will clear the legal position." He paused. "Any future arrangement, should one be desired, can be constructed from the beginning, by parties who are fully informed and acting without coercion." He said this last sentence with the precise neutrality of a man who had drawn a legal line and was not crossing it, which Margaret found she respected enormously. "Thank you, Mr. Reid," she said. He inclined his head. "Your grandfather would have handled this exactly as you did, Miss Dunbar," he said. "I knew him briefly in my early years of practice. He was a man of considerable clarity." She received this simply. "Yes," she said, "he was." She left Kincaid Castle on the morning of the 20th of September, with Fiona beside her in the carriage and the Highland history book in her travelling case, the torn letter still inside it, now evidence in a legal process that would take months to resolve, but not yet surrendered, held a little longer as the material proof of something she had found and understood, and acted on. Alistair stood at the top of the entrance steps as the carriage was brought around. He had arranged for an outrider to accompany them as far as Perth, which was both practical and unnecessary, and was, she understood, the form that care took between people who were not yet in a position to express it directly. "Edinburgh," he said, as Thomas opened the carriage door. "Edinburgh," she confirmed. He did not say when, neither did she. When was a conversation for later, for letters across a distance, for the gradual construction of something that deserved to be built properly. They had both, in 4 days, demonstrated a capacity for patience under considerably more difficult conditions than this. She stepped into the carriage. The door closed. The carriage moved forward across the gravel, and she looked out the window as they passed the entrance gate and turned onto the Perth road, and saw Kincaid Castle recede behind them into its frame of Scots pine and wet hillside and pale morning sky. Fiona, beside her, said nothing for several miles. Then, "He will write within the week." "Possibly," Margaret said. "Within the week," Fiona said with complete certainty, and opened her needlework. Margaret looked out at the Perthshire hills rolling past in the morning light, the heather, the grey stone walls, the glimpses of the Erne running clear and contained again between its proper banks, and thought about what came next. The bank, Drummond and the board, the legal proceedings, the long work of making right what had been made wrong, and somewhere inside all of that, carried quietly and without hurry, the beginning of something else. Something she had not come here to find and had found anyway, in the particular way that important things are found. Not by looking for them directly, but by being honest in a difficult situation and paying attention to who is honest alongside you. The letter arrived on the 26th of September, 6 days after she left Kincaid Castle, 7 days before she had told herself to expect anything. It was not long. He was not a man who used more words than necessary. It said that the Edinburgh legal proceedings were progressing, that Douglas had cooperated fully with the sheriff's inquiry, and that this had been noted, that Elliot, Robert Elliot, retired secretary of Heriot Row, had been contacted and had expressed relief of the particular kind that belongs to people who have carried a difficult thing alone for too long. It said that the East Garden, which had looked destroyed by the storm, had begun to recover faster than expected. It said, "When you are ready, I would be glad to come to Edinburgh. Or if you prefer, we could meet somewhere neither of us has history. I leave the choice to you. I find I trust your judgment." She read it twice at the desk in her father's office, her office now, the bank's books open in front of her, Drummond's careful reorganization already underway, and then she took out her own paper and wrote back. The reply was not long either. It said, "Come to Edinburgh. I know a good place for a first conversation that belongs entirely to us. Bring nothing from Kincaid Castle except yourself." She sealed it, addressed it, and gave it to the postal clerk on her way out of the building. Walking back through the Edinburgh streets in the late September light, she thought that this was how it should be. Not the conspiracy's arrangement, not the 30-day clause, not the architecture of other people's ambitions, but this, two people choosing, deliberately and without coercion, to continue. It was, she thought, a considerably better beginning. Some stories begin with a grand design, elaborate arrangements made by people who believe they can engineer the futures of others with sufficient cleverness and sufficient greed. The story of Margaret Dunbar and Alistair Kincaid began exactly that way. Constructed in an Edinburgh club between two men with debts and ambitions, dressed in the language of alliance and respectability, delivered to its principles as something they had no real choice but to accept. What the architects of that arrangement failed to account for was the particular danger of placing two honest people in a dishonest situation. Honesty under pressure does not diminish, it clarifies. And two people who are each independently committed to seeing things as they are rather than as they are told to be. Such people, when they find each other, become something that no conspiracy can easily contain. What endured beyond Kincaid Castle was not the contract which was withdrawn, not the arrangement which was dissolved, not the conspiracy which was dismantled stone by stone, through the patient work of courts and lawyers and the testimony of a retired secretary on Heriot Row who had waited 6 years for someone to listen. What endured was the choice, made on a flooding morning in Perthshire, made again in an Edinburgh office 6 days later, made continuously in the quiet way that real choices are made, to build something that belonged to them and no one else. Honour costs something. Alistair Kincaid paid the cost of telling the truth about his father and carried that payment without complaint, which is the only way such things can be carried. Margaret Dunbar paid the cost of 4 years of careful management under a guardianship designed to outlast her patience, and emerged from it not diminished but clarified, knowing precisely what she was and what she intended, which is the most useful thing that adversity can produce if you refuse to let it produce bitterness instead. The urn returned to its banks, the garden recovered, the bank was restored. These things take longer than 4 days and are less dramatic and matter considerably more. Now I want to hear from you. What moment in this story stayed with you the most? Was it Margaret finding that torn letter alone in the library at midnight, the breakfast table conversation that changed everything, or the letter that arrived 6 days early? If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you already know what kind of storytelling lives on this channel. Historical, emotional, and built to stay with you. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because the next story is already taking shape, and it begins somewhere you won't expect. And if this story moved you, leave a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells us that stories like this are worth making. Thank you for being here. Until the next story, take care of yourselves